Tasha Williams stood in the crowded courtroom, her palms clammy despite her efforts to remain composed. The room was filled with the hum of low voices, the occasional rustle of papers, and the sharp, commanding tone of the judge. She could feel the weight of every eye on her, even though she barely noticed the faces of the people around her. All that mattered was the man sitting high above them, the judge. Judge Daniel Carter. A face she hadn't seen in over a decade, yet a face that was now uncomfortably familiar. Her case wasn't complex. She had been caught speeding, but what had felt like a simple mistake had turned into a moment of dread the minute she entered the courtroom. Tasha had tried to prepare herself. She'd read the traffic violation pamphlet. She'd memorized the polite script for explaining the circumstances. She had been rushing to a meeting for her nonprofit, one that could help hundreds of people. But now, with her heart pounding in her chest, she wasn't sure whether any of that would matter. The judge glanced up from his papers as Tasha was called forward. Judge Carter was the same man she remembered from their time as college roommates, only older now, his dark brown hair speckled with gray, his face creased with years of experience and authority. In their college days, he had been ambitious, confident, maybe a little arrogant, but he had always been kind to her. They shared late-night study sessions, long talks about their dreams, and moments of laughter that had brought them closer. Back then, he had seemed so different, open, eager to learn, full of possibilities. But today there was no trace of that young man in his steely gaze. As she stood before him, she was no longer the hopeful college student with big dreams. She was a woman, navigating the harsh realities of the world, constantly fighting for recognition in a system that often seemed designed to push her down. She hadn't been prepared for how his presence would rattle her. "Ms. Williams," Judge Carter began, his voice a calm but firm baritone that echoed through the room. "You were caught speeding on Springdale Avenue, going 25 miles over the limit. This is a serious violation. Your actions endangered the lives of others. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Tasha swallowed hard, trying to keep the quiver out of her voice. "Yes, Your Honor," she said, trying to sound confident, though she could feel the eyes of the entire room on her. "I apologize for speeding. I was rushing to an important meeting for my nonprofit, a project aimed at helping underprivileged children gain access to education. It won't happen again." There it was, her explanation. It wasn't much, but it was all she could give. Her nonprofit had been her life for the past 5 years. She had poured everything into it, faced countless obstacles, and yet she was still here, standing in front of a man who had once been her friend, someone who didn't know the half of what she had fought for. Judge Carter didn't flinch. He didn't even seem moved by her words. His gaze was impassive, almost distant, as if he were evaluating her not as a person, but as a case to be judged. "I see," he said, scribbling something on his pad. "While your work is admirable, it doesn't excuse breaking the law. I hereby fine you $500. You have 10 days to pay." The gavel struck, and the sentence was final. Tasha's stomach dropped. The fine wasn't the problem. It was the fact that she felt invisible to him. The man who had once known her, who had shared in her dreams, had now made her feel small, insignificant. This wasn't just a traffic ticket. This was a reminder of the world she had been trying to change, and how little it seemed to care. As she turned to leave the courtroom, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The past, the future, and the present were tangled together in ways she hadn't expected. Was this really the same man who had once been her friend? Was this what he had become? And then it hit her. What if this wasn't just about a fine? What if this moment would lead to something much bigger than either of them had imagined? The crisp fall air of Harvard University was filled with the buzz of students hurrying from one lecture to the next, a backdrop of youthful ambition and unspoken competition. Tasha Williams stepped onto the campus with a mixture of awe and nervous energy. As a scholarship student from a small working-class town, she had always dreamed of attending a prestigious university, but now that she was here, it felt surreal. She was determined to make the most of the opportunity, even if the weight of being one of the few students of color often felt like a constant pressure. She walked past the towering Gothic buildings, heading toward her freshman dorm, Dunster House, her heart pounding with anticipation. It was there she would meet her new roommate, Daniel Carter. Daniel was the polar opposite of Tasha in many ways. He came from an affluent family in a suburban area, his father a well-known corporate lawyer. His blue eyes and neatly combed hair gave him an almost polished, untouchable air. When Tasha first walked into their shared room that day, she was greeted by a stack of textbooks neatly arranged on his desk, a sports bag hung by the door, and the unmistakable scent of expensive cologne. "Hey, you must be Tasha," he said with a friendly smile, standing up from his desk to offer his hand. "I'm Daniel. Looks like we're roommates." Tasha, though initially caught off guard by his easy smile and confident demeanor, shook his hand with a firm grip. "Nice to meet you." The first few days were filled with small talk, the awkwardness of getting to know someone new in such a personal space. They came from different worlds, and it was clear from the start. While Daniel's life seemed to revolve around prestigious internships, family dinners, and social gatherings, Tasha spent her time navigating her scholarship work and getting involved in student organizations. She rarely had time for the lavish events Daniel often attended, but his stories about them were both fascinating and a little alien to her. Despite their differences, Tasha couldn't help but admire his ambition. Daniel, for his part, seemed genuinely curious about her life. He would often ask her about her hometown, her background, and what had brought her to Harvard. As the weeks went by, their conversations moved beyond the surface. They debated late into the night about politics, social justice, and their future careers. Tasha opened up about the systemic barriers she felt at times, and Daniel, though initially ignorant of many of the struggles she faced, listened intently. Late one evening, as they sat on their shared dorm room floor, studying for an exam, Tasha found herself laughing at something Daniel had said. He was telling a story about his first year trying to understand complex legal theories and how he had been thrown off by an unexpected exam question. His charm and wit made it impossible for her not to smile. "You know, you're not so bad, Carter," Tasha said, tossing her pen aside as she leaned back against the wall. "I thought you'd be one of those rich kids who thinks everything's handed to him." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "I'm not like that," he replied, his tone more serious now. "I work hard for everything I have." Tasha regarded him for a long moment before speaking again. "You know, sometimes people don't realize how hard others have to work just to get by. You have a lot of advantages I don't have, but I'm not going to hold that against you. We all have our different battles." Daniel was quiet for a moment, contemplating her words. It was clear that he hadn't fully grasped the weight of what she had said, but it planted a seed in his mind. That night, as they both prepared for bed, their bond had deepened, even if Daniel didn't yet understand the full extent of the challenges Tasha faced. The next few months flew by in a blur of studying, late-night coffee runs, and occasional deep conversations that stretched into the early hours of the morning. Tasha's passion for social justice was contagious, and Daniel, although still unaware of the full scope of her experiences, found himself reflecting on things he had never considered before. He admired her drive, her intelligence, and the quiet strength that she carried with her every day. It was during these late-night discussions that they both realized just how much their lives had shaped who they were, but it was also when they both began to understand how differently they viewed the world. Tasha's belief in fairness and equality challenged Daniel's more idealistic view of how things worked. But in those moments, sitting side by side in the warmth of their dorm room, those differences didn't matter. They were just two young people trying to figure out the future together. Years after graduation, Tasha Williams and Daniel Carter had drifted apart, their once close friendship shaped by time and the diverging paths they each followed. For Tasha, the transition from the sheltered environment of Harvard to the harsh reality of the real world had been anything but easy. But her passion for change remained unwavering, even as life continually threw obstacles in her path. She worked tirelessly to establish her nonprofit, dedicated to helping underprivileged communities gain access to education and essential resources. There were countless setbacks, funding issues, bureaucratic red tape, and moments when she questioned if the work was worth it. But Tasha's resolve never wavered. She knew that the children she helped were depending on her, and she couldn't afford to give up. Her nonprofit slowly began to gain recognition, though it often felt like one step forward and two steps back. Still, every time she faced a setback, she found new ways to adapt and push forward. Tasha poured everything into her cause, dedicating her time, energy, and savings to ensure that the voices of the marginalized were heard. Every success, no matter how small, made the struggle worth it. Meanwhile, Daniel had followed a more traditional path, one that seemed almost preordained for someone from his background. His family connections had opened doors for him early on, and his sharp intellect quickly propelled him to the top of his law school class. After graduation, he landed a prestigious job at a well-known law firm. But despite his success, something was missing. Daniel had always been driven, but the constant cycle of corporate work began to feel hollow. There was no deeper sense of fulfillment, just a succession of cases and clients that lacked any personal connection. So he pivoted, making the decision to use his law degree to serve the public, eventually becoming a judge. It was a position of power and respect, but as his career advanced, Daniel found that the weight of his responsibilities was often accompanied by a sense of detachment. He had become part of a system that seemed far removed from the world he had once shared with Tasha, the world of idealism and progress. Daniel often thought back to those late-night conversations in their college dorm room, the debates they'd had about justice and inequality. Back then, he had been driven by the idea of change, but now, as a judge, he couldn't help but feel that the idealism of his younger self had been replaced by the pragmatism of the law. He knew his decisions impacted lives, but he was often lost in the sea of rules and regulations, questioning how much he truly understood about the people who appeared before him. Tasha's name occasionally came up in news articles or social media feeds as she continued to advocate for the causes she believed in. He admired her tenacity from afar, but over the years, the connection between them faded into the background of his busy life. Daniel's circle had grown narrower, limited to those in the legal world. And Tasha, although her work had gained recognition, was still a lone figure fighting against a system that seemed so much bigger than her. Neither of them knew it at the time, but the paths they had chosen would eventually lead them back to one another in ways neither could have anticipated. It wasn't until he saw Tasha on a local news segment that everything changed. She was speaking passionately about a new initiative her nonprofit had launched, one aimed at providing scholarships for students of color. Her words resonated deeply with Daniel. He realized just how much he had lost touch with the world outside his courtroom, the very world Tasha had dedicated her life to improving. He felt a surge of guilt and curiosity. How had they ended up so far apart? And why had he never reached out to see what she was doing? The man he had become, the judge who handed down sentences every day, suddenly seemed worlds away from the young man who had once shared everything with Tasha. It was a Thursday evening when Daniel Carter sat down on his couch, scrolling through the news on his tablet after a long day in court. His eyes were tired, and his mind was still running through the cases he'd heard earlier, cases that had weighed heavily on him, as they often did. Despite his best efforts, Daniel had never quite adjusted to the emotional toll of the courtroom. The fact that his decisions shaped people's lives, sometimes in ways that felt arbitrary or cold, had started to gnaw at him. As he flicked through the local news app, his thumb paused over a headline. Tasha Williams launches scholarship program for students of color. The photo accompanying the article was of a confident, smiling Tasha, now in her early 30s, speaking passionately at a press conference. Her face had changed, but Daniel would know it anywhere. The sharp features of her face, her intense eyes, that smile, he remembered them all too well. He sat up straight, a jolt of recognition hitting him hard. It had been years since they'd last spoken, and even longer since they had shared that dorm room. But Tasha's face on the screen brought it all rushing back. The late-night study sessions, their conversations about dreams and ideals, and how different the world had seemed back then. But Tasha had changed. She was no longer the young woman figuring out how to balance her scholarship and her future. She was an accomplished activist, someone who had built a nonprofit from the ground up, who had created opportunities for others. She was a woman who had taken on a fight bigger than herself, a fight Daniel had long since forgotten. The article detailed the new initiative, which aimed to provide scholarships for students of color, as well as mentorship and resources for navigating higher education. Tasha's words were powerful, her dedication clear. As Daniel read, something within him stirred, guilt, admiration, but also confusion. How had Tasha gone from his college roommate, struggling alongside him, to becoming this powerhouse of change? How had she transformed the world she had once shared with him into something that could actually make a difference? The guilt was overpowering. He had been a judge for several years now, and though he had worked to be fair, to make decisions based on the law, something in him realized he hadn't really seen or understood the world the way he should have. He had become absorbed in the framework of legal texts, in balancing justice and procedure, but he had lost touch with the real people behind the cases he judged. Daniel replayed their college years in his mind, remembering their discussions about systemic inequality and justice. Back then, he had been so sure that the law could fix everything. But now, as a judge, he was beginning to question whether the law was enough to address the deeper issues that Tasha had always seen so clearly. The system he was a part of seemed too entrenched in its own rules, too blind to the struggles of people like Tasha, people who fought every day to make their voices heard. Unable to shake the feeling that there was more to this story, Daniel searched the article for a contact number. His fingers hovered over the screen, and for a moment he felt uncertain. Was it too late to reach out? Would she even remember him? But guilt, more than curiosity, pushed him forward. He needed to know how Tasha had gotten here, and more importantly, why he hadn't recognized her, her fight, her strength, sooner. After a brief hesitation, he dialed the number provided, hoping against hope that it wasn't too late to reconnect, to finally understand what had become of the woman who had once been his closest friend. The moment Daniel dialed the number, a wave of unease swept over him. It felt surreal, as though he was reaching into a past that had slipped away, something he hadn't touched in years. The phone rang once, twice, and then a voice on the other end answered. Tasha Williams speaking. Her voice was warm, yet calm, confident, as he remembered, but tinged with a subtle weariness. For a moment, Daniel was taken aback. How many years had it been since they'd last spoken? Their time at Harvard felt like a different lifetime now. He cleared his throat, trying to gather his thoughts. Tasha, this is Daniel Carter. We were roommates back at Harvard. I don't know if you remember me, but I saw an article about you today. What you're doing, the scholarships, the nonprofit, everything. I just wanted to reach out. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Daniel could almost hear the wheels turning in her head. She probably wasn't expecting a call from him, especially not after all this time. I remember you, Daniel, she said finally, her voice steady, though he could sense the caution in her tone. It's been a long time. It wasn't the warm, familiar greeting Daniel had hoped for. It wasn't an invitation to reconnect, but it wasn't entirely cold either. He could sense her guardedness, a natural result of the years that had passed, the distance between them, and perhaps the years of challenges she had faced that had shaped her into who she was now. I know it's been a while, and I've thought about you a lot since we last spoke. Daniel continued, his words rushing out. I'm not sure if you've been following my career, but I'm a judge now, and I've spent a lot of time reflecting on everything. I saw your interview earlier, and I guess I just want to say that I'm sorry for not reaching out before, for not being the kind of person I should have been when we were in college. Tasha didn't speak right away, and the silence between them felt heavy. Daniel's heart beat faster, his mind racing as he wondered if his apology was even worth it, if it could possibly heal the years of unspoken distance. "I don't think you fully understand what you're apologizing for, Daniel," Tasha finally said, her voice quieter now, more thoughtful. "You weren't just a college roommate to me. Back then, you were someone I trusted, someone who shared my dreams, my struggles. But as we went our separate ways, I realized something. You, and people like you, had no idea what it was like to navigate this world as someone who had to fight for everything. I didn't just want your apology, Daniel. I wanted your understanding." Daniel winced at her words, feeling the sting of truth in them. He had never fully understood the weight she carried. He had been oblivious, blinded by his own privilege and the ease of his path. Back then, he hadn't seen it. He hadn't seen her daily battles, her resilience in the face of adversity. "I see that now," Daniel said quietly, his voice sincere. "I've spent a lot of time thinking about the conversations we used to have, Tasha. About justice, about what's fair. I always thought the law was the answer. But now, as I've sat on this bench, I see that the law isn't always fair. It doesn't always serve the people who need it the most. I've realized that I haven't been the person I wanted to be, or the person you deserved as a friend. And for that, I am truly sorry." Another long pause followed, but this time it felt less tense. Tasha seemed to be considering his words carefully, perhaps weighing whether this apology could truly lead to something meaningful. "You've made progress, Daniel," she said finally. "I'll give you that. But understanding is more than just saying the words. It's about actions, about using your position to create real change. You can't just apologize and move on. It takes more than that." "I know," Daniel replied, feeling the truth of her words settle in. "And I want to do more. I don't expect this to fix everything between us, but I'd like the chance to make things right, not just with you, but with everyone I've failed to understand. I'd like to learn more. I'd like to help." Tasha didn't immediately respond, but her silence didn't feel cold. It felt like the beginning of something. It was a moment of possibility, fragile but real. "I'll think about it," she said softly. "We'll see." As the conversation ended, Daniel leaned back in his chair, his heart still racing, but lighter than it had been in a long time. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The work Tasha had dedicated her life to was monumental. But this, he realized, was just the beginning of something new, an opportunity to be part of the change he once thought only the law could bring. After their conversation, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that his life had taken an unexpected turn. The days that followed were filled with a growing sense of urgency, a desire to do more, to understand, and to make a real impact. He had spent so many years believing that the law was enough, that it was the ultimate tool for justice. But now, after talking to Tasha, he understood that the law could be a part of the solution, but it couldn't fix everything. It couldn't address the systemic inequities that had shaped the lives of people like Tasha, people who fought every day against barriers that the law often ignored or upheld. Daniel spent the next few weeks immersing himself in research. He read books and articles on social justice, systemic racism, and the experiences of marginalized communities. He reached out to legal scholars, activists, and people who had lived through the struggles he was just beginning to understand. He began to see the gaps in the legal system that had once seemed so clear-cut to him, the ways in which it favored those with power and privilege, while leaving the most vulnerable to fend for themselves. But as Daniel worked to expand his understanding, there was still a part of him that felt disconnected. No matter how many books he read, no matter how many experts he spoke to, he couldn't fully grasp what it was like to walk through life as someone who had been denied opportunities simply because of the color of their skin. He couldn't understand the weight of the systemic injustices that Tasha had spent years fighting against. It was a sobering realization, and one that he wasn't sure how to reconcile. But then, one evening, he received a call from Tasha. It had been weeks since their conversation, and Daniel had been wondering if she would follow through on her promise to think about his offer. When he saw her name pop up on his phone, he felt a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. "Hello, Tasha," he said, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. "Hi, Daniel," Tasha replied, her tone more relaxed than the last time they spoke. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation, and I think it's time we had another one, this time in person." Daniel's heart leaped. A chance to meet, to talk face to face. He hadn't expected this so soon, but he knew it was exactly what he needed. "I'd love that. When would be a good time for you?" "I'll be in the city next week for an event," Tasha said. "We can meet up then." They arranged to meet at a local cafe, a quiet place Tasha suggested where they could have an honest conversation without the distractions of their busy lives. Daniel spent the days leading up to the meeting with a sense of nervous excitement. He had no idea what to expect. Would Tasha still be hesitant, still unsure of his intentions, or would she give him the chance to prove that he was serious about learning, about changing? When the day finally arrived, Daniel arrived early, waiting nervously at a small corner table in the cafe. He ordered a coffee, but he barely touched it as he watched the door, his mind racing with possibilities. A few minutes later, Tasha walked in, her presence unmistakable. She wore a casual yet professional outfit, and there was a quiet confidence in her stride. She spotted Daniel almost immediately and walked over, her eyes meeting his with a calm, assessing look. They exchanged greetings, and Daniel stood up, offering a hand to shake. Tasha took it, her grip firm but not overpowering. They sat down, and for a few moments there was a comfortable silence between them. Tasha looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and caution, but also something else, a sense of openness, as though she was willing to see where this conversation might lead. "So Daniel," Tasha began, leaning forward slightly, "I've been hearing a lot about your work, about your decisions as a judge. What's been going through your mind since we last talked?" Daniel took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "I've been reflecting a lot, Tasha. I've realized that I've been too comfortable in my role. The law isn't enough. It can't be enough. There are too many gaps, too many people left behind. I want to do more. I want to understand more. And I want to use my position to help create real change." Tasha nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "It's a start," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But understanding isn't just about reading books or talking to the right people. It's about being willing to listen. It's about standing beside people, not just above them." Daniel's heart raced as he absorbed her words. He knew that she was right. True change wasn't about grand gestures or making public statements. It was about the quiet, consistent work of listening, learning, and then acting with empathy and purpose. He had a long way to go, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. "I'm ready to listen," Daniel said, his voice filled with sincerity. "And I'm ready to take action. I don't know exactly what that will look like yet, but I want to find out. I want to work with you, Tasha. I want to help you make the kind of change that matters." Tasha studied him for a long moment, her gaze piercing yet measured. Finally, she nodded. "We'll see, Daniel. But you're starting in the right place. Let's see where this goes." And just like that, something had shifted. There was no guarantee of success, no promise that their paths would align perfectly. But for the first time in a long while, Daniel felt the weight of hope, a hope that maybe, just maybe, he could make a real difference. As the weeks passed, Daniel threw himself into his newfound mission with a fervor he hadn't felt in years. Tasha's words were still fresh in his mind, echoing like a reminder. Understanding isn't just about reading books or talking to the right people. It's about standing beside people, not just above them. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but each step forward felt like a small victory, a reminder that he was finally moving toward the kind of justice he had only believed in, but had never truly acted upon. Their first meeting had been a turning point, But it was just the beginning. After that conversation, Tasha had invited Daniel to several of the events her nonprofit was hosting. Fundraisers, community outreach programs, and school visits where she directly interacted with students and families. At first, Daniel felt like an outsider. He had grown up in a world where success was measured by academic achievement and professional recognition. But this world was different. The people Tasha worked with weren't concerned with status or titles. They were focused on survival, on building futures despite a system that often seemed designed to keep them down. At a fundraiser for the scholarship program, Daniel found himself standing at the edge of a room full of people who were living proof of the disparities he had once ignored. Many of them had overcome hardships that he could scarcely imagine. There were stories of single mothers who had fought tooth and nail to get their children into college, stories of students who had navigated an unforgiving school system just to graduate, and stories of community leaders who had spent their entire lives advocating for change. Each story hit Daniel harder than the last. He had always thought that his work as a judge had given him a glimpse into people's struggles, but this was different. These were real people, people with names, with dreams, with voices. One afternoon, Tasha took him to a local high school where her nonprofit was helping mentor students. The gymnasium was filled with young people, all of whom had aspirations of going to college, though many of them faced barriers that seemed insurmountable. As Tasha spoke to the group, Daniel watched from the back, listening as she connected with them in a way he hadn't seen before. She didn't lecture them. She spoke to them like they were equals, encouraging them, inspiring them to reach for what seemed impossible. Daniel couldn't help but be in awe of how naturally she moved through these spaces, how effortlessly she made people feel seen. Later, as they walked out of the gym together, Daniel couldn't hold back his thoughts any longer. Tasha, I had no idea. No idea what these kids are up against. I thought I understood, but I don't. I've been judging people without ever knowing their story. Tasha glanced at him, her expression soft but serious. You're starting to understand now, she said, but understanding isn't enough. You have to keep showing up. You can't just step in and out of these spaces when it's convenient. If you want to make real change, you have to be here, for the long haul. Daniel nodded. He understood what she meant. This wasn't just about using his position as a judge to dole out rulings. It was about using his privilege and his platform to advocate for policies that addressed the root causes of the disparities these students faced. It was about getting involved in the community, not from a position of power, but as an ally, someone willing to fight beside them. It wasn't easy. Daniel faced resistance from some of his colleagues. As he started to advocate for systemic changes within the court system, he was met with skepticism and outright hostility from those who were comfortable with the status quo. But Tasha had warned him this would happen. Change is hard, she'd said. But if it were easy, it wouldn't matter. Each time Daniel encountered pushback, he remembered the faces of the young students he had met through Tasha's nonprofit. He remembered their stories, the way they had been told their entire lives that they weren't enough, that they didn't belong. He couldn't let that be the world they inherited. Slowly, Daniel began to make waves. He pushed for reforms within the court system to better address issues like racial profiling and inequities in sentencing. He worked to ensure that young people from marginalized communities were given a fairer chance in the justice system, advocating for restorative justice programs that emphasized rehabilitation over punishment. The more he learned, the more he saw the connections between his work as a judge and the work Tasha was doing, helping people who had been ignored for too long, lifting up those who had been pushed to the margins. One day, Tasha called Daniel to update him on a new initiative she was launching. "We're expanding the scholarship program," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "We want to help more students, but we need more resources. I'm hoping you'll be able to help us with that." Daniel didn't hesitate. "Of course. Whatever you need. I'll do everything I can." For the first time in years, Daniel felt truly connected to his work. The cases he handled in court had become more than just legal matters. They were about real people, real lives. He was no longer just a judge. He was an ally, a partner in a fight for justice that was long overdue. And as he watched Tasha continue to lead with passion and conviction, he knew that this was only the beginning of the change they could create together. Months passed, and Daniel's transformation became undeniable. He had spent years being a figure of authority in a courtroom, but now, as he worked alongside Tasha and her nonprofit, he began to see the world through a much wider lens. The partnership between them had grown into something powerful, something that transcended the limitations of their past. Tasha's scholarship program had expanded beyond anything either of them had expected. With Daniel's support, they were able to secure funding for more students, helping them get into college with the resources they needed to succeed. Together, they had advocated for policy changes that would better support students of color in their pursuit of education and careers. Daniel's position as a judge had given them the leverage they needed, and his voice was now one that resonated with lawmakers, people who could make real change happen. The more he learned, the more driven he became, and the more he realized how little had been done in the past to address the systemic issues that plagued the communities he now worked for. But it wasn't just about policy or funding. It was about people. It was about the faces he had seen in Tasha's outreach programs, the stories that had touched him deeply, and the realization that his role as a judge had allowed him to give back in ways he hadn't imagined. He had once thought his job was to simply uphold the law. Now he knew his duty was to serve the people, to listen to their stories, and fight for justice in every form it took. One day, Tasha invited him to speak at one of the nonprofit's largest events yet, an annual gala that brought together donors, activists, community leaders, and students. It was a moment of celebration, but also a call to action. Daniel, once hesitant and unsure about his place in this world of social justice, stood before a room full of people, feeling a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. As he stood at the podium, he looked out at the crowd. Faces that reflected struggle, hope, and determination stared back at him. And then his eyes found Tasha in the front row, smiling at him with a look of pride. He had come a long way since that first phone call. He had apologized for his ignorance, but now, standing before this room, he realized that it wasn't just an apology that mattered. It was the work that followed. "I've spent my career upholding the law," he began, his voice steady, "but I've learned that the law, in its current form, doesn't always work for everyone. It doesn't always work for people who have been pushed to the edges of society, people whose voices have been silenced for far too long. Tasha Williams taught me that justice isn't just about following the letter of the law. It's about making sure everyone has a seat at the table, that no one is left behind." The room was quiet, every ear attuned to his words. He could feel the weight of what he was saying, but also the hope that the future could be different. That change was possible. "It's not enough to apologize," he continued. "We must act. We must stand together, fight together, and build a future where justice is something that belongs to all of us, not just the privileged few. I am proud to stand with Tasha and this incredible community, and I am committed to doing everything I can to create real, lasting change." As he finished his speech, the applause that filled the room was deafening. But it wasn't just for him. It was for the movement they had built together, for the people whose lives they had touched, and for the promise that, with dedication and solidarity, they could rewrite the future. Later that evening, Tasha approached him, her expression softer now, but still filled with that quiet confidence. She smiled at him, a smile that carried years of struggle, growth, and triumph. "You've come a long way, Daniel," she said, her voice full of warmth. "I think you're beginning to understand what this is all about." Daniel nodded, his heart full. He had. He had finally learned what it meant to fight for something greater than himself, to fight for people who had been overlooked for too long. And in that moment, standing next to Tasha, surrounded by the community they had built, he understood that the work was far from over. The journey had just begun. As they looked toward the future, there was a shared understanding between them. The road to justice was long, But it was one they would walk together, and with each step, they would continue to lift up the voices of those who had been silenced, working side by side to create a world where true equality wasn't just a dream, but a reality.